For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. Sometimes, you can do the right thing for the complete wrong reason. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a hypothetical example. Let's say that you have one spot left on your roster, and you have to determine who is getting that final spot. There's one player who seems to be slightly better than the other player, and that player plays a position that is a bit weaker for you right now, so they have a better chance at getting playing time. At the end of the day, you decide to keep that player over the other player, which makes a lot of sense because they're better and they're at a weaker position. However, the reason that you do that is not because of anything that I mentioned. The reason that you did that was because you flipped a coin and it just so happened to land on that player, because that player was assigned tails, and the coin landed on tails. That seems like a terrible reason to keep someone, doesn't it? You made the right roster decision, but you did it based on no sound logic whatsoever, and you did it in a way that seems grossly unfair to the other player in question, because it was something completely out of their control that didn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. Speaking of making the right decision, be sure to make the right decision by hitting that like button and subscribing down below and turning that notification bell on. We're trying to hit 60,000 subscribers and build the best football community on the platform to talk all things NFL history all the time. So make sure that you're here for all the action. And thanks in advance for your support. Well, I bring this up because, while not based on a coin flip, a similar thing happened in 1973 to the man that you've been watching this whole time. This is running back Don Nottingham, and he ended up playing on two teams throughout his NFL career. The first team was the Baltimore Colts, but midway through his career, he was traded within the division to this team right here, the team's AFC East rival, the Miami Dolphins. And the reason why he was traded? It didn't have to do with poor play or just losing a numbers game with other running backs in the Baltimore backfield. It didn't have to do with a feud with the coaching staff or the front office. It didn't have to do with money or salary-related reasons. Instead, it had to do with the reason that made absolutely no sense when it happened in 1973, and still makes absolutely no sense when you look at it more than half a century later. Because this is the story behind the bizarre trade of Baltimore Colts running back Don Nottingham to the Miami Dolphins, and what might just be one of the most confusing and perplexing trades in the history of the NFL. Before I talk about the actual trade in question, where this man right here, Don Nottingham, got traded from the Baltimore Colts to the Miami Dolphins, we need some context to understand just who Nottingham was, and why the Colts were interested in possibly dumping him in the first place. In the 17th round of the 1971 NFL Draft, with pick number 441, as in the second to last pick of the 442-person draft, the Colts decided to draft the Kent State running back. Keep in mind, when you're drafting a guy in the 17th round, you're expecting absolutely nothing. Of the final 45 picks from that draft class, a grand total of 6 of them played a snap in the NFL. Getting literally one snap out of a 17th round pick meant that you did your job, and it's safe to say that by drafting the human bowling ball, the Colts did just that and then some, as Nottingham was an extremely good runner who played an instrumental part in Baltimore's offense during his first 2 seasons with the club. In 1971, he found the end zone 5 times during the regular season, and most notably, in their divisional round game against the Cleveland Browns, a game where the Colts won 20-3, the Colts scored 2 touchdowns. Both of them were scored by Don Nottingham, who had 92 yards rushing on the day as well. And after a successful 1971 season, the fullback returned in 1972 and improved on some of his numbers, picking up 657 yards from scrimmage, which was the second most on the team, only behind Don McCauley. Through his first 2 seasons, the penultimate Mr. Irrelevant was proving to be anything but that, as including the playoffs, he had found the end zone 10 times and had over 1,200 yards from scrimmage. However, even though Nottingham was off to a solid start to his career, There were two problems in 1973 that led to his quote-unquote demise with the Colts. And these problems were no fault of his own, especially seeing as the general manager of the Colts by this point was Joe Thomas, who was not in the front office when the Colts drafted Nottingham in 1971. So he had no ties to the man whatsoever. Number one, there was another running back that needed to get the ball, because he was super explosive and was more of a dual threat. That man was this man right here, as in one of the best and maybe the most underrated running backs of the 1970s, Lydell Mitchell. Mitchell was drafted by the Colts in the second round of the 1972 draft, so 1 year after Nottingham was drafted. And by this point in 1973, especially after a game against the New Orleans Saints in a 14-10 win, where he had 133 rushing yards and had over 6 yards per carry, it was clear that he had to be the feature back. Mitchell wound up having an unbelievable career with the Colts, as before things went sour toward the end, and I mean really sour, he made it to 3 Pro Bowls, was named an AP second-team All-Pro twice, finished inside the top 5 of the league in rushing yards in 3 straight years, and even led the entire NFL in receptions in both 1974 and 1977, helping to revolutionize what a running back can provide on offense and in the passing game. Considering the fact that he ended his 6-year career with the Colts with over 8,000 yards from scrimmage, including over 1,000 during 1973 at the time of this story, I think the Colts made the right call in realizing that the feature back had to be Lydell Mitchell. And as a result, Don Nottingham's carries took a dip, which makes sense. But you would think that you can just play Nottingham at a fullback, right? Well, not quite. Because problem number 2 was this man right here. There was another player at fullback who was ahead of Nottingham on the depth chart, and that was Don McCauley. Under the guidance of new head coach Howard Schnellenberger in 1973, McCauley moved from running back to fullback. And the Colts obviously liked McCauley a lot, seeing as they used a first-round pick on him in 1971. And the decision to have McCauley ahead of Nottingham on the depth chart also understandably made a ton of sense. Remember that in 1972, even though Nottingham had the second most yards from scrimmage on the team, the man in front of him at number 1 with 931 yards was Don McCauley. It was also a decision that made sense looking back on it in hindsight, as McCauley would play 11 seasons with the Colts, playing all the way until 1981, and finishing his career with just under 6,000 yards from scrimmage while finding the end zone 57 times, which to this day ranks 6th all-time in franchise history. And all 5 guys ahead of him are either in the Hall of Fame, in Marvin Harrison, Lenny Moore, Edgerrin James, and Raymond Berry, or will more likely than not get in the Hall of Fame at some point in Reggie Wayne. Again, it's not as though Nottingham was a bad player, because that couldn't be further from the truth. He just got caught in a numbers game behind Lydell Mitchell and Don McCauley. With that, after that game against the Saints where both McCauley and Mitchell ran for over 100 yards each, this man right here, Don Nottingham, seemed like the odd one out. They had their fullback and they had their running back. And on top of that, they had what they felt was a quality backup fullback in Bill Olds, who was the team's 3rd round pick out of Nebraska that year and would contribute a bit 1 year later in 1974. Nottingham had no ties to the current regime, and with that, he was on the trading block. It didn't take long for the Colts to find a trade partner, as Nottingham, along with a 6th round pick, was shipped off to the Miami Dolphins in exchange for running back Hubert Ginn. If you're wondering why they traded a running back for a running back, well, they were 2 different styles of runners. Ginn was one of the fastest players in the league, and the idea was that he'd be the backup to Mitchell and provide some speed on the outside, something that Nottingham could not do. Plus, Joe Thomas was in Miami when Ginn was drafted in 1970. But Ginn was also caught in a numbers game with Larry Zonka, Jim Kick, and Mercury Morris in that backfield. So the trade seemed beneficial to both parties. The Dolphins had their backup for Zonka at fullback, and the Colts had their backup for Mitchell at running back on the outside. Win-win for both parties. The trade makes sense, and everything is good to go, making this a complete non-story that should not be remembered more than half a century later. Or so you'd think, because then came the justification for said trade. Because you see, everything I just said about why the trade made sense was coming from me using the surrounding context. The actual reason that the Colts gave Nottingham as to why they traded him? It was absolutely asinine. Because do you want to know the real reason why the Colts traded Nottingham? I kid you not, it was because of crowd reaction. Seriously, crowd reaction. In that win against the Saints during Week 3, the crowd was more excited when Mitchell, who had over 100 yards rushing, and when McCauley, who had over 100 yards rushing, touched the ball compared to Nottingham. Which makes sense, because number one, Nottingham is not that type of runner. He's not a big play guy. And number two, the other two men had over 100 yards rushing. Plus, I dug high and low, and could not find anything, not one solid piece of evidence, to suggest that Nottingham was booed during the game. The reception seemed fairly typical. Mitchell and McCauley got cheers because they ran for over 100 yards. Nottingham was liked in Baltimore, and even scored a touchdown in that game against the Saints. And when he scores the touchdown, fans are cheering and are on their feet. So this seemed like a complete lie to say that the reason that Nottingham was traded was because of the freaking crowd and decibel levels. Said Nottingham, Coach Schellenberger told me that the crowd reaction to me Sunday against the Saints was one of the reasons I was traded. I didn't think the crowd was so rough on me. They didn't make as much noise to me as they did to Joe Thomas. Keeping in mind that Thomas was booed because he treated Johnny Unitas poorly, was an awful general manager, and destroyed a team that was a perennial contender for the last decade. Not even Nottingham was buying what the Colts were selling him. Plus, even if the crowd reaction was the reason why you made this trade, and based on all accounts, it was, why would you say that? I'm not even talking about it from a deflecting responsibility standpoint, as in, don't blame me for this, blame the fans. Why would you let mob mentality dictate your front office decisions? Why would you let drunken fans influence vital decisions for your team? Do you have an applause meter that tracks how many decibels a player gets when he's introduced? And when said player falls below a certain decibel level, you put him on the trade block? How does that make any sense? You know at games where they tell you to make some noise and they show that fake decibel meter? Maybe that's what they're doing. Maybe that's literally why it's there, so that they can gauge trade interest. Guess what? Larry Fitzgerald got the loudest applause at every single Arizona Cardinals game where he was introduced. But toward the end of his career, that didn't mean he was the best player on the team. Tim Tebow probably got way more applause when he was introduced out of the tunnel in 2011 by the Broncos versus a guy like Demaryius Thomas. But that didn't mean that Tebow was better than Thomas. Judging how good a player is and how important a player is by advanced analytics like decibel level on crowd reaction is an insane way to do business, and it's something that no sane team should do. Plus, there are tons of other factors in how loud a crowd is, including the weather, how the game is going, and the stakes of the game. So to base a decision off of freaking decibel levels is... I don't even know what to say to that. I genuinely don't. And the funny part is that even though the Colts didn't need this man right here, Don Nottingham, and they probably made the right move trading him at some point, just because he was the odd one out and wouldn't have had a lot of playing time with the emergence of Mitchell and the transition of McCauley from running back to fullback, they still lost the trade handily, as this didn't work out for the Colts in the slightest bit. Hubert Ginn had just 47 yards rushing for the Colts in 1973 before finding himself back in Miami in 1974. So the Dolphins lost absolutely nothing of value. They traded away a player, won a Super Bowl, and then got said player back. And the 6th-round pick that the Dolphins acquired from the Colts was used on defensive tackle Randy Crowder, who started every game at defensive tackle for the team in 1976 and finished with 7.5 sacks in 1975, which was the second most on the team that year. So the Dolphins got back the player they lost half a year later and also got a decent rotational option for a few years, while the Colts got nothing. So based on history, Trading a guy because of the fans and their reaction to a particular player is probably not a smart idea. Just a thought. And again, I want to emphasize with this team behind me right here and the trade involving Don Nottingham to the Miami Dolphins, that even though this trade didn't work out in the end, I completely understand the logic in terms of trading him. You weren't going to play him a lot. He was not going to get the ball compared to Mitchell and McCauley. And based on how well Mitchell and McCauley played, not just for the rest of the 1973 season, but going forward, even into the 80s in the sense of McCauley, I get the idea. Believe me, I get the idea, even though it didn't work out. Right idea for the trade, but horrible logic. Absolutely backwards and asinine logic that no one, especially someone in a prominent position, should ever employ in their lives. So as a word of advice to any general managers out there right now who might be watching this video for whatever reason, if you're going to make a trade, doing it based on crowd reaction and decibel level might not be the smartest way to do it. Just like you wouldn't put a poll out on social media asking whether a player should be traded, you wouldn't do this. Joe Thomas was an absolutely horrible general manager with the Colts. And this example with this man right here, Don Nottingham, is a forgotten exhibit of why that was the case. Because in 1973, because of crowd reaction of all things, for the Colts, Don Nottingham was not in plans. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.